Good morning. Today is Sunday, May 19th, 2024. Last week we discussed the mitzvah of counting the Omer. It was in yesterday's Torah portion, the Parsha of Emor. Last night we counted 26 days of the Omer, and that means that a week from today is Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. And in this week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Behar, we also have a similar mitzvah of counting. The Torah says that we count the years to the Yovel year. There are sets of 7 years where in Israel we are allowed to work the fields in Israel for 6 years. And then there's Shemitah, the 7th year where we let the land lay without working it. And then we have the next 7 years. So during the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, they would count the years of 7 times 7, 7 Shemitah cycles that would lead up to the 49th year, 7 times 7, 49th year. And then they would have the 50th year, which was the Yovel, the jubilee year. And we've discussed some of the consequences that would take place, the changes within society which would take place in the Yovel year. But there was a mitzvah to count the years leading up to the Yovel, the jubilee year. However, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks points out that there is a difference in the counting of the Omer and the counting of the years, and it's a difference that does not get picked up well in the translation. You have to see it in the original. Because in last week's Parsha, concerning counting the Omer, the Torah says in the plural, Usafartem lochem, you plural should count the Omer. And that's obvious because every single one of us has the obligation to count the Omer. So you count the Omer, and you count the Omer, and I count the Omer, Usafartem lochem. Each of us counts the Omer. But in this week's Torah portion, concerning counting the years leading to the Yovel, the Torah says, V'safarta locha, you individual count the Omer, the years. You individual, one person, one body counts the years. It's the 36th year, it's the 41st year, and now finally it's the 49th year. And the reason is different. The reason for the difference is the mitzvah of counting the Omer applies to every individual. Everyone has the mitzvah to count. You count, I count, they count. So it's in the plural because the Torah is telling all of us to count. But the mitzvah to count the years is a mitzvah that is specifically on the Sanhedrin, the great court that met in Jerusalem beside the Beit HaMikdash. They were the ones that counted. It was not a mitzvah for each individual to count. It was a mitzvah on the Sanhedrin, the great court, to count as a whole on behalf of the entire nation. That's part of why we do not have the system of Yovel years today. I can't tell you what year in the Yovel cycle we are because we do not have that system, because we do not have the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. That's one of the reasons that this Yovel law is not applicable. But Rabbi Sacks says that from here we derive a very important lesson in leadership. As individuals, we focus on day-to-day details. What do I need to do today? What do I need to do tomorrow? What is in my immediate future? But as leaders, and I don't only mean leaders of a country or leaders of a community, but I also mean leaders of a family, and I also mean the leaders of ourselves. There are times when we ourselves need to act as leaders of ourselves. As leaders, we have to count the years. We can't only think about what do I need to do today. Yes, I know, there's a very famous phrase, one day at a time. And one day at a time is very important for an individual. But there are times when a person needs to think ahead. What's going to be in a month from now? What's going to be in a year from now? What's going to be in 5 years from now? Sometimes even the individual who is living day by day also needs to think, where do I want to be in a year? Where do I want to be in 5 years? And what do I have to do to get there? Our rabbis tell us, famous line in Pirkei Avos, Ezehu Chacham, who is a wise person, says Ben Zoma, Misha Roa Es HaNolad, the person who can see the consequences into the future, the person who can see what it's going to look like into the future and what decisions now need to be made to get to the future that I want. Excuse me. Leaders, if they are wise, think about the impact of their decisions for many years from now. And often the failure of leaders is to be too focused on the moment and not to see what's coming in the even short-term future. There's a famous quote in the 1970s. The Chinese leader Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought about the French Revolution in 1789, and he answered, "Too soon to say." I remember many years ago, early in my career, and I really knew nothing about the job of being a rabbi. I had a friend. He was the executive director of the Federation, where I was serving in New Orleans at that time. And this person was a very process-oriented person. He talked about management systems. He used a lot of buzzwords. And the truth is, I learned a lot from him. So he once asked me, I guess I was in my late 20s. He once asked me, Michael, what is your 5-year plan? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And how are you making plans to get there? I had no idea. I had never heard anybody ask that question, much less ever consider such a question. But it was a formative conversation for me. And so sometimes now, I think about my 5-year plan. And I think about what steps I need to take now in order to make that plan a reality. And of course, it adjusts. It's flexible. But I ask you, what is your 5-year plan? For yourself, for your family? Where do you want to see yourself in 5 years? And what are the steps you need to take now in order to get to where you want to be in 5 years? Recently we discussed, and we've discussed this many times, the way that the Haftorah is chosen as a passage from the prophets to be read on Shabbos morning after the Torah reading that connects thematically with the subject of the Parsha, but also connects thematically in a way that is inspiring and uplifting, usually. So this week, because the Parsha of Behar and Behukosai are separate, we have a Haftorah for Behar and a Haftorah for Behukosai. We're going to discuss both of them with God's help. But I want to discuss with you now the Haftorah for this Shabbos, the Parsha Behar. And the Haftorah goes like this. It's a passage from Sefer Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah. And God says to Yirmiyahu, buy a field. This is the location of the field. This is the owner of the field. This is how much you should pay. Make sure that you write a sale contract. Take witnesses to witness the sale. Count the money carefully that you pay for this field. And take the sale contract and put it in a safe place. That's the Haftorah. So I ask you, is that inspiring Okay, maybe if you're a notary, it's inspiring, but otherwise it's to be honest, a little bit boring. I mean, it's a real estate transaction. What's the message? And what's the inspiration? The message and the inspiration comes from the date. Hashem commanded Yirmiyahu to buy a field in Israel after God had told him that the first Beis Hamikdash would soon be destroyed. And the Jewish people were about to be exiled. Well, now the passage in Yirmiyahu is not boring, it just sounds crazy. Why buy a field in Israel if it's about to be destroyed and conquered? And the people exiled, and people from other nations are going to come live there. Why in the world would you buy a field? And this sets up the most powerful and inspiring lesson the prophet Yirmiyahu has to teach us the antidote of what is coming in the Torah. Because in next week's Torah portion, we're going to have the Parsha Behukosai. And of course, we'll be discussing that next Shabbos, next week. But of course, as you remember in the Parsha Behukosai, there's a long passage where the Torah tells us, where God tells us, if you do not follow my laws, God says, God forbid, then a lot of terrible things are going to happen, including exile. And the truth is, we have witnessed every single one of those terrible things come to pass. But we are provided in this week's Haftorah with the antidote. Israel. This is what God, the Lord of hosts, the King, the God of Israel says in our Haftorah. Od yiknu batim v'tzados v'kramim be'eretz hazos. There will come a time in the future when people will again buy houses and fields and vineyards in this land. There will be destruction, God says to Yirmiyahu. Near the end of the first temple period, the Beis Hamikdash is going to be destroyed. Israel is going to be conquered. You're going to go into exile. There will be desolation. And there will even be despair. Just as the next Parsha warns, B'chukosai, it all came to pass. But God says to Yirmiyahu in our Haftorah, before it happens, God says, I'm telling you now, before it happens, don't despair, because Jews will return to Israel. In fact, this moment of impending destruction is the best time to buy because the prices are lower. Don't just count the days. Don't just look at today, tomorrow, the short term, Ve'ezmir, Beis Hamikdash is going to be destroyed, terrible things are happening, oy vey, what's going to be, what's going to be. We also have to plan ahead. And the Jewish people took Yirmiyahu's message to heart. Now, not all Jews. Sadly, many Jews gave up hope during the time of the exile into Bavel, to Babylonia. They gave up hope that they would ever return. And even more so during this long galus of all 2,000 years. Many Jews just gave up hope. And I'll tell you something, and we'll talk about this later, but there's a very, very sad thing going on in Israel now. There are people in Israel, and I'm not criticizing, I'm not judging them, because they're going through things that you and I here have no way to be able to connect with. But there are Jews in Israel today that are giving up hope, that have decided to move, that have decided to leave. We just can't take it. We just can't take it. It's too much. We're leaving. And it's not a gigantic number, but it's a significant number. And it's understandable. It's understandable, but it's not true. Because we have a promise. And the promise is this week's Haftorah. God promises us that even though there will be destruction, even though there will be difficult times, Od yiknu batim v'sados ukromim be'eretz hazos, there will again be a time when you will buy houses and fields and vineyards in this land. And I'm telling you now, if I had money to invest, I would invest money in Sderot, I would invest money in Metula, in the northern part of Israel, where people have been exiled, people have been dislocated because of the difficulty. It is the best time to buy because we have a promise that we will come back to those places, that there will at some point be security for Israel in all parts of Israel. That's a promise from God. And so this real estate deal, with all of its mundane details, becomes the most inspiring message to the Jews living before the destruction of the first temple, to the Jews living before the destruction of the second temple, and I would say to us today, as much as to any other time in the past. This is the promise. It's going to be bad. It's going to be difficult, but I promise you, it's going to get better. I heard this story a number of years ago, and the first time I heard this story, I immediately thought about the Haftorah and the message that I'm sharing with you. The Panovich Rav was Rabbi Shlomo Kahneman. He survived World War II, the Holocaust. He went to Israel. And he bought land for a new yeshiva. He bought land for a new yeshiva in a place that later came to be called Bnei Brak. At that time, there was nothing there. The land was very cheap because this is before the state of Israel. The British were about to withdraw. In 10 days, the Arabs were going to invade. The land had no value. So the seller asked him, he was very glad to unload this land at any price. The seller asked him, what are you going to do with this land? And Rav Kahneman said, I must rebuild the yeshiva of Panovich, which existed in Europe. I am building a yeshiva to restart after the Holocaust. By the way, at this time, Rav Kahneman was 61 years old. He had lost his entire family in the Holocaust except for one son. He once said that every night since 1939, he cried before going to sleep. But he said, I want to build a yeshiva. The seller said to him, but you're only going to have this land for 10 days. In 10 days, they're going to invade and take it away from you. And Rav Kahneman answered, a yeshiva for 10 days is also a yeshiva. That's the attitude that was necessary to build the yeshiva to last for 100 years. And that Panovich yeshiva today, I was there a year ago. I visited. It's one of the most vibrant, one of the largest, most influential yeshivas in the entire world. Yes, you have to think about today, one day at a time. You have to think about tomorrow. But you also have to think about what's going to be in 100 years. And when it comes to Israel, we have a promise. no matter what today looks like, no matter what tomorrow looks like, Od yiknu batim v'chaseros v'kramim be'eretz hazos. That's God's promise. There is a mitzvah for all of us to count days. Usfartim lachem. What am I doing today? What am I doing tomorrow? I have to pay attention to that. But we also need to act as leaders of the Sanhedrin of our own lives. We have to count years, we have to count decades, we have to count centuries, we have to count millennia. V'safarta lach. Like the Sanhedrin, with vision. Ezehu chacham haroa es hanolad. Who is wise, who can see what will unfold in the future, what will be the long-term consequences. And we are meriting seeing those long-term consequences unfold today in our lives. May they continue to do so, and may all of God's promises come true soon for the Jewish people and for the world. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.